What's the creepiest display of intelligence you've seen by another human? Story 1. Back in my retail days, there was this guy who worked the register with me. Let's call him Matt. Matt was a walking credit card scanner. Seriously, the dude could memorize credit card numbers after just one glance. It wasn't just the 16 digits. He remembered the expiration dates and CVVs too. We thought it was some weird party trick, but then he got fired. Turns out he'd been using the numbers to buy adult content online. Not like high-end stuff either, just weirdly specific subscriptions. We found out when a customer reported charges and described the purchases in detail. Creepy and honestly, oddly pathetic. Dude could have been a literal savant but chose porn instead. Story 2. I had this roommate in college who treated relationships like science experiments. He had an actual notebook dedicated to his girlfriend. It listed everything: her favorite foods, what phrases made her smile, even which compliments had the highest success rate. One day I stumbled on a chart titled, "If X, then Y will calm her down unless Z is involved." I asked him if it was creepy to reduce someone to variables, and he shrugged, saying, "Hey, it works." They eventually broke up, and I'm 80% sure he emailed her new boyfriend a PDF manual titled, "How to Handle Sarah." Genius? Creepy? Maybe both. Story 3. In high school, there was this kid in my calculus class who never spoke. He didn't even bother with the homework. Then during finals week, he shows up and aces every exam, including some bonus problems even the teacher hadn't solved. Turns out he'd spent the last few days watching YouTube tutorials on double speed. The teacher handed him his A+ and said, "Who the hell are you?" He just smiled and left. Now that I think about it, he'd probably been planning this from day one. Silent genius or lazy mastermind. Either way, he's probably running a hedge fund now. Story 4. I once worked at a school for kids with anxiety, and one of my duties was taking a 13-year-old on a stress relief walk. We're walking outside when a plane flies overhead. Out of nowhere, this kid says, "That's flight 247 from Chicago to Newark, cruising at 3,500 feet. I stared at him and he goes, "It's a Delta flight. See the winglets?" He was dead serious. I Googled it later and he was absolutely right. How a kid stressed about math tests could casually know FAA flight paths is still beyond me. Story 5. There's this hairdresser I see and she remembers everything. First time I went, she nailed my cut, no problem. But the second time? She greeted me by name, asked if I still used clip-ins, and listed exactly how she'd styled my hair months ago. She even remembered that I hated rainbow sprinkles but loved chocolate ones. Yet halfway through she couldn't recall which side I parted my hair on and kept asking. Memory genius, sure, but I'd kill for her to remember the left side every now and then. Story 6. Once I was on a ride along with a cop. Let's call him Dave. We stop a random guy on the street, just a routine check, and Dave suddenly says, "I know you." The guy insists they've never met. Dave starts rattling off his name, his parents' names, and an incident from 20 years ago when Dave arrested his dad for being drunk. The guy was a kid back then, but Dave remembered every detail. The guy was weirded out, and honestly, so was I. Dave just shrugged it off like it was no big deal. Dude was basically the human version of a search engine. Story 7. My cousin has Down syndrome, and one day we were at the golf range. He loved watching me play, but he'd never tried himself. I handed him my wedge and a few balls just to see what would happen. First swing, perfect. Second swing, same. Every shot was dead straight and landed in a tight grouping about 80 yards out. I'm standing there with my jaw on the floor, but he just shrugs and goes back to his Gatorade. I've begged him to try playing seriously, but he says it's boring. Meanwhile, I'm over here hacking divots the size of my head. Story 8. There was this guy in my unit back in Afghanistan who we called the Cyborg. He had this insane ability to connect the dots between obscure intelligence reports, no matter how old or random. We'd get a report about weapons smuggling, and he'd go, "This ties back to a shipment mentioned in a footnote 3 months ago." He was right every single time. Because of him, our team intercepted so many operations, and every single person came home alive. It's like his brain was part computer. I always felt like a kid trying to keep up with an adult at the genius table. Story 9. My high school had this one quiet kid everyone ignored until the physics fair. He rolls up with this contraption he'd built in his garage, a fully functioning robotic arm. When the judges asked how he did it, he casually said, "I watched a few YouTube videos and reverse engineered the design." The arm was so advanced that some engineering professor asked if he'd consider publishing a paper on it. The rest of us had baking soda volcanoes and potato batteries, and he was out here auditioning for Iron Man. Story 10. One summer, my uncle invited me to work on his drag racing car. I was standing next to his friend, a mechanical engineer, when my uncle asked, "How many revolutions does the rear tire make in an eighth mile?" The engineer barely glanced at the car and goes, 70 1/4. My uncle checked later with a calculator, and it was spot on. Not close, exact. The guy just shrugged and said, "I like numbers." Meanwhile, I was doing the math on how many beers he had before he answered. Story 11. At a family dinner, my 11-year-old cousin, who's a little intense, whips out his phone and starts playing a brain surgery video during dessert. As kids start gagging over the lamb curry, he pauses the video and starts explaining the procedure step by step, correcting mistakes and suggesting better techniques. My uncle, a surgeon, confirmed later that he was completely accurate and using methods still under research. I guess that's impressive, but I still can't eat lamb without hearing his voice explaining scalpels. Story 12. My brother's friend could instantly recognize any plane flying overhead and tell you the make, model, and flight details. He'd casually point out, "That's a 737 MAX heading to Denver," like he was reading a sign. One time, just to test him, I played a random YouTube video of a plane taking off. He watched for 3 seconds and said, "That's LAX, Delta Flight 1423 to Atlanta." I looked it up, and he was 100% right. It's cool, but also makes me think he missed his calling as an air traffic controller. Story 13. In college, I had a friend who could memorize entire textbooks. We were in a general chemistry class, and he never showed up until the midterm. On the day of the test, he casually walked in, finished in 20 minutes, and left. When the professor handed back the graded tests, he stared at the guy and said, "Who are you?" He'd gotten the highest score in the class. Turns out he'd spent one night skimming the book and memorized everything, down to the page numbers. The rest of us were pulling all-nighters just to scrape by. Story 14. My neighbor's kid was about 9 months old, and I was helping watch her one afternoon. I'm reading her a book and noticing that every time I say a word like frog or ball, she points right at it. Thinking it was a fluke, I ask her to find something random like a star that's on a different page. She flips back, finds the star, and points. I was stunned. I tried more words, even made up some nonsense, but she nailed it every time. Meanwhile, I can barely remember my car keys most mornings. Story 15. When I worked at a pharmacy, we had this older lady who'd been counting pills there for decades. One day, she looked at a bottle of ibuprofen and said, "That doesn't look right." She dumped them out, counted, and sure enough, there were only 99 pills instead of 100. She'd spotted the mistake just by glancing at the bottle. Everyone joked about how she should enter jelly bean guessing contests, but honestly, I'd bet money she'd clean up at those. Story 16. In high school, I had a classmate who never did any of the calculus homework. A week before the final, he bought a practice book, worked through the problems over a couple of days, and walked into the exam like it was no big deal. He ended up scoring 100%. The rest of us spent months struggling, and I barely scraped a B. I asked him how he did it, and he shrugged and said, "I just read it once, and it made sense." I still think about him whenever I have to use my calculator for basic division. Story 17. When I was in the military, there was a guy in my unit who could learn any language like it was nothing. He started with Spanish and Portuguese, then moved on to German, Arabic, and Farsi. By the end of the year, he was writing books in those languages. He said his trick was translating songs he knew into the new language, how the locals would say it. Meanwhile, I barely made it through my 9-month German class and still butchered the accent. The guy was like Google Translate, but with way better accuracy. Story 18. There's this hairdresser I know who blows my mind every time I visit. After months, she'll greet me by name, ask about my kids, my job, and even remind me about something random I mentioned once, like my love for chocolate sprinkles. Yet she constantly forgets which side I part my hair on. She'll ask 3 times during one appointment. It's like her brain is a Rolodex of life details but can't hold a single hair part in place. I still go to her, though. It's oddly comforting to be remembered that well. Story 19. I used to have a coworker who could calculate anything in his head, and I mean anything. One day we were working on a project, and I joked about how many paper clips we'd need to cover the floor. Without missing a beat, he looks around, does some mental math, and says, 4,372, give or take 50. We tested it later, and he was scarily close. It was like working with a human calculator, except he used this superpower mostly to figure out random trivia instead of anything useful. Story 20. My cousin once casually brought up that he thought my aunt's dishwasher was on its last legs. When asked how he knew, he said the hum sounded off. A week later, it completely broke down. Same thing happened with someone's car. He listened to the engine for 5 seconds and guessed the problem. Turns out, he was right every time. It's great when he's around for stuff like that, but I'm convinced he's part robot or something. I wouldn't be surprised if he secretly talks to machines. Story 21. I knew a kid in high school who was so good at pool it was borderline creepy. He could calculate the angles for bank shots, combo shots, and even multi-cushion setups instantly, like he had the game pre-programmed in his brain. He'd win every time, and not just by a little. He'd leave everyone in awe. I once asked him how he did it, and he shrugged and said, "Geometry just makes sense to me." The rest of us couldn't even figure out how to hold the cue properly. Story 22. One time, a 14-year-old I knew was helping his dad drywall a staircase. Without taking a single measurement, he cuts a piece of drywall, and it fits perfectly, like a glove. His dad joked that he should go into construction, but the kid just shrugged and went back to playing video games. I still can't cut wrapping paper straight, and this teenager was eyeballing precise angles like it was nothing. Story 23. I had a friend in college who could pick up any musical instrument and play it flawlessly within an hour. Someone once handed him a violin at a party, and by the end of the night, he was playing Vivaldi. Same thing happened with a saxophone, a guitar, and even a harp. He swore he wasn't that talented and said it was just about figuring out the mechanics. Meanwhile, I couldn't even figure out how to play Mary Had a Little Lamb on a piano with labeled keys. Story 24. At a family reunion, my 8-year-old nephew started reciting every country in the world, their capitals and their flags. I thought it was cute until someone asked about a random island, and he launched into a full history lesson about its colonial era, trade routes, and current political status. The adults just stared at him in stunned silence. I joked that he should go on Jeopardy, but honestly, I'm a little afraid of what he'd do with that kind of power. Story 25. There was this guy I met during my summer job at a hardware store who could identify the size, length, and threading of any bolt or screw just by glancing at it. One day, a customer came in with a box of mismatched screws and said, "I need more of these." The guy looks at one for 2 seconds and goes, "That's a 1/420 by 1-inch machine screw, zinc-plated." We checked the inventory, and he was dead on. I asked how he did it, and he just shrugged, saying, "I've seen a lot of screws." Understatement of the century. Story 26. My sister-in-law has this insane ability to remember everyone she's ever met. It doesn't matter if it was a quick introduction 15 years ago. She'll greet you by name and remind you what drink you ordered at some wedding. It's impressive until you're out with her, and she waves at strangers who have no clue who she is. It's awkward when they pretend to remember, and she starts recounting entire conversations they've probably forgotten on purpose. It's like her brain has a Rolodex, and none of us can figure out how to clear it. Story 27. One time, my old boss walked into a meeting with a busted laptop charger. He plugs it in and nothing happens. Instead of getting mad, he pulls a tiny toolkit out of nowhere, takes the charger apart, and starts fiddling with the wires while still talking about quarterly reports. 5 minutes later, it's working perfectly again. None of us said anything, but I'm convinced he's secretly part of some secret tech wizard society. Who casually fixes electronics in the middle of a budget meeting? Story 28. I had a friend who could do advanced mental math, but he used it for the dumbest things. We'd be out drinking, and he'd calculate exactly how many beers we'd need to get everyone at the table buzzed based on weight, tolerance, and ABV. It was like having a human BAC calculator, except it was way less helpful when we actually needed a ride home. He probably could have worked for NASA, but instead, he was the guy at parties explaining which shot would optimize your night. Story 29. My mom's friend once asked me to help her 1-year-old while she cooked. I'm reading this picture book to the baby, and every time I say a word, she points to the right picture. I test her by asking where the cat is. It's on a completely different page, and she flips back, finds it, and points. I ask for a fish, and she does it again. I was so freaked out I stopped reading. Babies aren't supposed to know how to navigate books, right? Story 30. A guy I used to work with had a ridiculous memory for faces. Once we were at a coffee shop and he spots a woman he claims he met at a wedding years ago. He walks up to her, says her name, mentions her cousin who got married, and asks if she still works at the bank. She looked so shocked, I thought she'd call the cops. She admitted he was right, but honestly, it felt less impressive and more like a magician performing a trick where no one asked for a show. Story 31. There was a kid at my high school who could memorize license plates. It started as a party trick, but one day he caught someone trying to key a teacher's car. He calmly recited the guy's license plate to security before the dude even made it out of the parking lot. Everyone thought it was cool until someone realized he'd been memorizing our plates too. He swore he wasn't doing anything weird with it, but I made sure to start parking on the other side of campus after that. Story 32. My uncle was one of those mechanical geniuses who could fix anything with duct tape and intuition. One time, his lawnmower broke, and instead of buying a part, he rigged it to work using a spare belt and an old screwdriver. It worked perfectly, but he warned us not to tell his wife he'd borrowed her screwdriver for good. The scary part is that it wasn't a one-off. He's fixed a washing machine, a grill, and even his truck with random household junk. I swear he's one step away from building his own Iron Man suit. Story 33. There was this one guy in our neighborhood who was a little too into his lawn care. One day I saw him standing in his yard, staring at a patch of grass like he was in a deep meditation. A few minutes later, he announces to no one in particular, "That's a fungal issue." He disappears into his shed, comes back with a mix of random chemicals, sprays the spot, and 2 days later, it's like the grass had a full makeover. The man had no formal training, just an unsettlingly accurate intuition about grass diseases. Story 34. In college, I shared a dorm with a guy who could read ridiculously fast. I once handed him a book for a class, joking that he wouldn't finish it before our test the next morning. He handed it back an hour later with the entire plot, main points, and quotes I could use in the essay section. I accused him of having a photographic memory, but he said, "Nah, I just skim efficiently." Efficiently? I barely finished the introduction before the test, and he got an A while I clung to a pity B. Story 35. My buddy's son once sat through a family poker night and no one paid him any attention. He was only 11 and eating cookies in the corner. By the third game, he asks if he can play. We let him join, figuring he'd fold every hand. He cleaned us out in under an hour. Turns out, he'd been watching everyone's tells all night, quietly counting cards, and baiting us into bad moves. I asked him how he knew to do that, and he just said, "I saw it in a movie." Kid made $150 that night. Story 36. When I worked as a bartender, one of my regulars had an insane ability to recall details about everyone. If you came in once and ordered a whiskey sour, he'd remember it 6 months later, along with the story you told about your dog. One night, he starts rattling off my life like he'd been shadowing me. My favorite drink, my sister's name, even the fact that I hated mushrooms. It was flattering, but also kind of unsettling. I started mixing his drinks a little faster after that. Story 37. There was a guy in my calculus class who rarely talked but always wore this old Casio watch. During one test, someone asked what time it was, and he starts explaining how the watch worked, down to the mechanics of the gears. Then he casually mentioned he'd built one just like it from scratch when he was 14. We all stared at him like he'd just admitted to time travel. After that, I was too scared to ask him for help with derivatives. What if he started building a chalkboard from raw materials first? Story 38. My sister once had a dog that could open doors. Not just push them open, he'd use his paw to turn the knob, and if it was locked, he'd wait until someone accidentally left it unlocked and then make his escape. He did it so often that they started installing child-proof covers, which he eventually figured out how to peel off. It got to the point where they were debating deadbolts because they were convinced he'd been taking notes during every interaction with a door. Story 39. I worked with a mechanic who had this eerie ability to diagnose car problems by sound alone. Someone would roll into the garage, and before the hood was even up, he'd go, "That's a loose timing chain," or "You've got a bad alternator." 9 out of 10 times he was right. I asked him once how he did it, and he just shrugged and said, "You learn to listen." I can't even tell when my microwave is done without the ding. Story 40. My cousin has an 8-year-old who can draw maps from memory like a human GPS. I gave him a random test once and asked him to draw a route from their house to the local park. Not only did he nail the streets, but he included tiny details like the cracked sidewalk by the gas station and the funky tree near the playground. I asked if he'd ever get lost, and he said, "No, but sometimes I pretend so people will help me." Genius or tiny manipulator? Probably both.